All right, let's dive into this juicy topic. Picture this ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, theater, and, well, a very unexpected role for sex in religion. No, we're not talking about your average toga party, although they probably had those too. We're talking about a time when sex was seen as spiritual. Yep, you heard that right. Spiritual. Like no need for candles and soft music, just a little divine ritual and sacred pleasures to make things right with the gods. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, wait, didn't these guys invent philosophy? Yes, they did. And yes, they had a whole lot of ideas about life, the universe, and everything. But somewhere in the mix was a bit of an enthusiasm for sensuality. You know, sex with a twist. Forget what your health teacher told you. Ancient Greeks were out here thinking that getting it on wasn't just fun. It was an essential act of devotion. Talk about commitment to the gods. Am I right? So let's take a step back and think about it. Picture yourself in the bustling city of Athens. You're walking around, maybe dodging a few philosophers, debating the meaning of life when you see something strange, a sacred temple, and in front of it, a priestess, but she's not just waving incense. No, she's performing a ritual, and it involves, let's just say, intimate offerings to the gods. But don't worry. It's all part of the divine plan? Or was it? You see, in ancient Greece, gods weren't just people with big personalities and cool outfits. Oh no. These guys had needs, and those needs included pleasure. They believed that the gods didn't just control the sun, the ocean, or the harvest. They also controlled the passion of human hearts. Sex, as it turns out, was an essential part of connecting with the divine. We're talking sacred prostitution, fertility rituals, and some seriously saucy divine love affairs. It was the kind of religion that really knew how to get people to show up for the service. But before you start thinking this is just some sort of ancient Greek Tinder, let's talk about what was going down in the temples. You've probably heard of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, right? Well, she wasn't just sitting there on a seashell like some kind of mythical Instagram influencer. Oh no, people got down to business in her name. In fact, some of her temples had sacred prostitutes. Yes, you heard me correctly. Who were there to perform ritual acts for the community. So people would literally go to these temples, make offerings, and get ready for this, engage in sexual rites to honor Aphrodite. Just imagine, hey honey, I'm just heading to the temple to connect with Aphrodite. You know, for the gods? Sounds a little different than your average religious experience, doesn't it? And if you're wondering if it was all about the women, oh no. Ancient Greek religion was very much about the balance of pleasures. Men weren't just sitting on the sidelines watching things go down. No, the gods wanted all kinds of services. The male priesthood had its own share of spiritual intimacy. In fact, some of these rituals involved male prostitutes offering services to other men as a way to pay respect to the gods. Because let's face it, sex wasn't just about pleasure, it was about honoring the divine, and sometimes that meant a little skinship with your fellow man. But hold on, we haven't even touched on the big event yet. Get ready, because this is where it gets really interesting. The Greeks didn't just have any old rituals. No, they had a particular festival dedicated to Aphrodite that was, let's say, more than a little unconventional. It was called the Aphrodisia Festival, and it was the kind of event that left very little to the imagination. Basically, it was a celebration of everything sexy. You could participate in a little light dancing poetry and sacrifice to Aphrodite, or if you were feeling adventurous, you could sign up for some of the more intimate rituals that were going down in the temples. Yeah, you could say this was one spiritual event. Imagine this people gathering not for some boring old worship, but for a grand festival of pleasure where they believed that by honoring Aphrodite in the most personal of ways, they could ensure good harvests, healthy children, and divine blessings. You'd think this would be the stuff of myth, right? But nope, this was part of the religion. And get this. The festival was so important that it was actually considered a serious duty for citizens to participate in. Duty sounds like a fun way to fulfill your civic responsibility, doesn't it? So next time you're at a temple in Athens, or scrolling through your Insta feed, just remember the Greeks were living their best spiritual lives, combining sex with the sacred, and making offerings in ways we might not fully understand today. All right, so let's keep unraveling this ancient Greek sexducation. Now, as strange as it may seem to us, these rituals weren't just spontaneous moments of pleasure, they were deeply embedded in the culture. The Greeks were all about balance. Right philosophers were concerned with the mind, but the priests and priestesses had a different view. They understood that for society to thrive, you needed harmony between the body, mind, and spirit. And what better way to connect with your spiritual side than by, making love? Let's take a deeper dive into some of the temples dedicated to Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Now, if you went to her temple, you could pray for beauty, fertility, and success in love, but you also had the option of worshiping her in a more direct, intimate way. And I'm not talking about whispering sweet nothings to a statue of her. No. They took it a step further. In some temples, the sacred prostitutes were often referred to as hierodoules, a fancy Greek word for sacred prostitutes. They weren't just there to entertain, they were part of the divine offering to the goddess. It wasn't about a casual encounter. It was a ritual, a sacred act to honor Aphrodite and ensure fertility, prosperity, and even good weather. If you're lucky, maybe you'll get a good crop, and maybe a little more than you bargained for. One of the more famous stories revolves around the Temple of Aphrodite in Corinth, which was basically the hotspot for these divine lovemaking rituals. According to some historians, the temple was so famous for its sacred prostitution that wealthy men would travel across the Mediterranean just to pay their respects, in very personal ways. In fact, it's said that this particular temple had upwards of 1,000 hierodoules. 1,000? And they weren't just sitting around waiting for someone to accidentally wander in. No, they were actively participating in the divine ritual. It was like the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card for your spiritual needs, as long as you were ready to get busy for the gods. But don't think for a second that it was all about Aphrodite. Oh no, the Greeks were nothing if not inventive when it came to their sexual rituals. They also had temples for gods and goddesses of fertility, like Demeter, the goddess of agriculture. Now that's where it gets interesting. Demeter was about the harvest, the earth, and life itself. But she wasn't always alone in her worship. In some rituals, people believed that to ensure good crops, they needed to tap into Demeter's nurturing power. And how did they do this? Well, some scholars suggest that fertility rites may have involved a bit more hands-on involvement. Picture it, the faithful gathering the gods overseeing the rituals, the harvest depending on the outcome. But unlike what you'd expect in a typical church setting, these rites were not about just a few prayers or offerings. It was more about physical engagement. The idea was that through sexual acts, the fertility of the earth would be mirrored in the fertility of the people. They believed that by engaging in these sacred acts, they were in direct communion with the gods and nature itself. It was kind of like a very direct way of saying, hey, we want a good harvest and we're willing to put in the work. No, not the kind of work you're thinking, but hey, the gods had needs too, right? Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about the big philosophical thinkers of the time. How did they feel about sex in relation to religion? Were they cool with it? Did they see it as something sacred? Or just another distraction? Well, it wasn't as open-minded as the temple-goers. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle weren't exactly fans of religion being intertwined with sex. In fact, Plato, who, let's face it, wasn't exactly a party animal, had some pretty strong views on the matter. In his works, he mentioned that sex should be reserved for procreation, and the true philosopher should focus on higher intellectual pursuits rather than indulge in the base pleasures of the body. And this is where it gets interesting, even Plato couldn't ignore the role of sex in the Greek worldview. In the Symposium, Plato discusses the idea of divine love, and suggests that love and attraction are ways of connecting with the divine and reaching towards spiritual enlightenment. So even if he wasn't into the whole temple prostitution thing, he did acknowledge that human intimacy and, yes, pleasure could be a pathway to higher understanding. A bit of an intellectual contradiction, right? But it wasn't just philosophers with their heads in the clouds who were thinking about sex in the context of religion. The average Greek was embracing it. Public rituals, festivals, and even family traditions often had a sexual element to them, and they didn't see it as something shameful or dirty. It was a celebration of life, of nature, and of the gods. For them, sexuality wasn't something to hide away. It was an expression of reverence, a physical manifestation of their devotion to the divine. And while some may have found this a bit out there to the Greeks, it was just normal. So next time you think about religion and sex, maybe don't just think of a quiet prayer or a solemn ceremony. Think about dancing, celebrating, and offering yourself in ways that well might shock your modern sensibilities. But in ancient Greece, that was all just part of life. Whether it was a festival, a temple ritual, or just a good old-fashioned sacred hookup, the Greeks knew that sometimes the road to spiritual enlightenment was a little more sensual than we might be comfortable admitting. All right, let's push on because we've still got some more spicy details to uncover. Now you might be thinking, okay, sure, the Greeks were into some weird stuff, but what about the Romans? Weren't they the more sophisticated ones? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Spoiler alert, the Romans were no strangers to taking the whole sex as religion concept to the next level. But before we hop over to ancient Rome, let's circle back to the Greeks for a second. It wasn't just the temples where these sacred encounters took place. Oh no, these rituals often spilled over into the public sphere. Ever heard of the Greek festival known as the Panathenæa? Think of it as the Olympics meets a giant spiritual rave. The festival was held to honor Athena, the goddess of wisdom, warfare, and somehow also sex. No, really. During this festival, among the poetry contests and athletic competitions, there were rites of passage that involved honoring her with various rituals. And yes, these included sexual rites as a means of spiritual communion. The idea was that by engaging in sex in the goddess's name, you were in a sense sharing in her wisdom and power. Imagine going to a massive festival, then being invited into a temple to join in the celebrations with the divine. It was basically a Greek version of the modern idea of a spiritual retreat, except, a lot more hands-on. And it wasn't just about Aphrodite and Athena. There were other gods and goddesses like Dionysus, the god of wine ecstasy and fertility, who were pretty fond of encouraging, shall we say, free-spirited rituals. Dionysus wasn't one to sit around contemplating the nature of the universe. No, he was all about the chaos. He wanted people to experience life in its fullest form through joy, ecstasy, and yes, a little bit of indulgence. So it's no surprise that his festivals, the Dionysia, often involved music dancing and a lot of uninhibited behavior. Picture a giant party where everyone is just so caught up in the divine ecstasy that they, forget their inhibitions. Imagine someone saying, yeah, let's honor Dionysus by having a really good time. It's safe to say that Dionysus was the original party god. The man literally invented the concept of letting loose, though instead of your typical Saturday night, it involved a lot of chanting wine and perhaps a little too much flirting with the divine. In fact, Dionysian rituals were known to sometimes feature group orgies, where participants would engage in sexual activities in order to create a sense of oneness with the god. And the weirdest part, they weren't ashamed of it. The orgies were seen as a form of worship, an expression of pure devotion. Dionysus wasn't about sitting back and contemplating the meaning of life. He was all about feeling it. And if that meant getting a little too close to your fellow revelers, so be it. It was all for the gods. Right now, let's talk about the Roman twist on all this. Just like their Greek neighbors, the Romans were all about religion, meeting pleasure. But they took things to an even more, let's say, opulent level. The Romans loved their gods, sure, but they also loved luxury and power. And nothing says power like being able to get away with anything under the guise of religion. It wasn't uncommon for Roman emperors to throw lavish feasts with all the right rituals, And that included more than just spiritual offerings. It was during these feasts that the more decadent side of Roman religion came to light. We're talking about rituals that were less about simple devotion and more about flaunting wealth and taking pleasure. Emperors like Caligula and Nero were known for using religion as a way to express their excess, and they didn't shy away from throwing extravagant sex parties in the name of the gods. These events weren't just about people coming together to worship. They were about showing off. Whether it was involving temple prostitutes or more scandalous affairs that bordered on orgies, these emperors knew how to throw a party with divine permission. And let's not forget the Lupercalia festival. The Lupercalia was a fertility festival that celebrated the coming of spring and the renewal of life. But surprise, it wasn't just about planting crops. It was also about getting fertile yourself. The festival included a pretty strange ritual where men would run around the streets of Rome dressed in animal skins and whip women. Yes, you heard that right, whip them, with strips of goat hide. The idea: to encourage fertility. And while it sounds a little too Game of Thrones for my taste, the Romans took it seriously. Women would line up to get whipped, believing that it would improve their chances of getting pregnant in the coming year. Talk about taking your fertility rights very seriously. Oh, and did I mention that after this strange whipping session, men and women were encouraged to pair off and, get together? Yes, just like the ultimate spring break, but with way more gods involved. So let's bring it all together here. In ancient Greece and Rome, religion wasn't just about praying and making offerings. Oh no, it was about living fully. If that meant spending time with temple prostitutes engaging in sacred orgies, or getting whipped by a dude in an animal skin, then so be it. It was all part of their spiritual connection with the divine. These cultures were all about the experience pushing the boundaries of what we consider normal religious practice today. And though we may cringe or laugh at some of their more unconventional practices, we have to admit they knew how to live with passion. And who knows, maybe there's a lesson there for all of us. Maybe we should all add a little more sacred passion into our lives. Not the kind with whips, though. Let's keep it classy, people. All right, let's finish this epic journey through ancient spiritual pleasures with a bang. As we wrap up, it's time to step back and reflect on the truly shocking ways that sex played such a central role in ancient religious practices. The one thing that really stands out from all this is how completely unashamed these ancient cultures were about integrating sexuality into the divine. For us today, it might seem bizarre. How could religion be so carnal? But in ancient Greece and Rome, religion and sex weren't two separate things. They were intertwined like a pair of old lovers who just couldn't stay apart. And the funny thing is, the more we look at it, the more we realize that the whole concept of sex as spirituality wasn't as wild as it first seems. Maybe it makes a little more sense when you consider the fact that life, death, nature, and everything in between were connected by the same universe of pleasure in the minds of ancient people. They didn't see a reason to separate their body from their soul. Why shouldn't you have a little fun while worshiping the gods? After all, they were all about the experience, right? Take a moment to imagine it. You're back in ancient Greece, strutting into a temple with your offering for Aphrodite. You've got a pretty good sense of what's coming, a little prayer, a little ritual. And maybe, just maybe, you're not alone in the temple today. Maybe there's a bit more action than you expected. But that's okay, because you've come to honor Aphrodite in the most intimate way possible. Your heart and body aligned with the divine. Sure, it's not the quiet, meditative experience that modern religion might offer, but to the Greeks, this was as sacred as it gets. It wasn't just about ritualistic fun either. These acts were thought to have divine consequences. Take Dionysus's festivals, for example. These weren't just times for debauchery, they were times for transformation. In the eyes of his worshippers, engaging in ecstatic rituals didn't just get you closer to the god, it was a way of understanding the divine. Sex to them was a way to transcend the normal, to experience a kind of union with the gods that couldn't be accessed through ordinary means. It's like the ultimate getaway, except instead of sandy beaches, you're getting tied up in divine ecstasy, metaphorically speaking, of course. And when it wasn't about physical pleasure, it was about the feeling of divine connection. Every passionate moment in those temples was seen as a literal channel between the human and the divine. How's that for getting in touch with your spiritual side? And don't even get me started on those very unique rituals, like the Lupercalia in Rome. The idea of running through the streets in animal skins, cracking whips, and encouraging fertility? It's wild, right? But the Romans believed in it with such fervor that it's hard not to appreciate their absolute devotion to the concept. They weren't shy about using any means necessary to ensure the fertility of the land and their people, for that matter. It's like if every day were Earth Day, but with a lot more physical engagement and way more public involvement. Sure, today we don't run around naked or engage in fertility whippings, at least I hope we don't. But you know what? Maybe there's a part of us that still holds on to that ancient spirit, whether it's in the joy we feel when celebrating life or the bonds we form with others. The ancient Greeks and Romans didn't just worship their gods, they lived with their gods. They embraced life's pleasures, sensual and spiritual, without the shame that often surrounds these topics today. In their eyes, life and love were always meant to be experienced to the fullest. And let's not forget, we can still learn a lot from these ancient cultures. Maybe not in the way they practice their religion. I think I can live without being whipped with goat hide, thanks. But in the sense that they celebrated life. They honored the good, the bad, and everything in between, and they did so without holding back. They didn't shy away from the messy, the sensual, the passionate parts of life. They embraced them as part of what makes us human. So what's the takeaway from all this? Well, perhaps it's that the next time you find yourself in a spiritual crisis, and let's be real, we all have those moments. Maybe it's time to rethink how you connect with the divine. Maybe it's not about sitting in silence for hours chanting mantras or lighting candles, though hey, that works for some people. Maybe it's about reconnecting with the world around you, embracing life's passions and celebrating the moments that make you feel alive. After all, that's what the Greeks and Romans did. They understood that you don't just pray with your mind, you pray with your whole being. And maybe that's the most divine thing of all. The next time you walk into a temple, or heck, the next time you just feel like really connecting with something greater than yourself, just remember, sometimes a little passion goes a long way. Just don't go whipping anyone in the streets. Okay, we're in the 21st century after all. And there you have it, folks. Who would have thought that the history of sex in ancient religion would be so intense? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the unexpected connections between sex and spirituality, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe for more unexpected lessons in history. And as always, keep living life to its fullest. Just maybe leave the whips at home.